Nathan Griffin walked into the restaurant, with the smell of engine grease still faint on his hands, looking for table 7. He found it. He stopped mid-step, one hand still on the back of an empty chair. Julia Hartman sat there, hands folded on the white cloth, the same woman he had reported to every week for 14 months. Her eyes met his and held there. For one long second neither of them reached for a menu, a chair, a word. The waiter hovered nearby with 2 glasses of water, unnoticed. Somewhere behind them, a door chime rang and nobody turned to look. Before you find out how 2 people who already knew each other froze across a blind date, neither one asked for a guess. Had either of them seen this coming at all? 3 days earlier, Megan Hartman had cornered Nathan by the bleachers at his daughter's soccer practice, arms crossed, refusing to let him say no a third time. "You work too much and you smile too little," she said. "I know someone. She's kind. She's busy, like you. That's all you're getting out of me." Nathan had known Megan for almost a year, ever since their kids ended up on the same team, sharing the same folding chairs on cold Saturday mornings. He knew her laugh, the way she brought extra orange slices for the whole bench, the way she talked with her hands when she was trying to convince him of something. He did not know her last name. She had never volunteered it, and he had never asked, because in Erie, work stayed at work and everything else stayed simple. That was the rule he'd built his whole life around, since Rachel died. His days had settled into a shape he could count on. Up before dawn, Sadie's lunch packed the night before, the yard by 6, home by 5 unless a shipment ran late, dinner together most nights at the same scratched kitchen table Rachel had picked out at a flea market the year they got married. He'd built the routine on purpose, brick by brick, because a life with no surprises in it was a life that couldn't be taken away from him twice. He almost said no again, the way he had the first 2 times. Then Sadie, 9 years old and stubborn in a way that reminded him painfully of her mother, looked up from tying her cleats and said, "You should go, Dad. You always tell me I should try new things." That settled it. He couldn't argue with his own line thrown back at him. Across town, Julia Hartman took the same call from her sister, with far less resistance, and far more caution than she let on in her voice. "His name's Nathan," Megan said. "That's all you get until Friday. No last name, no photo, no snooping." Julia had said yes before she let herself think too hard about why the name landed the way it did, settling somewhere behind her ribs, instead of passing through politely like most names did. Nathan was common enough. Half the men in Erie were named Nathan. She did not ask for a last name either. She told herself it was because she liked surprises, when the truth sat closer to the opposite of that she didn't want to know, in case knowing made her hope for something she had spent 14 months training herself not to hope for. She had taken the regional director post at Great Lakes Freight and Logistics 14 months earlier, and from her first week, she had made the Erie terminal her own, the busiest, the most complicated yard in the entire region, the one that needed someone watching it closely and often. That was the official reason she gave the board when they questioned why a director spent so many hours on the floor instead of in her office 3 towns over. It was true. It was also not the whole truth, and she knew it every time she walked the yard and found herself scanning for one particular supervisor before she'd even noticed she was doing it. Julia's family had built a piece of their name on the Erie waterfront 2 generations back, shipping interests that had grown quieter over the years but never disappeared entirely, and she had spent her whole career trying to prove she'd earned her position on merit, and not on the strength of a last name that opened doors before she ever walked through them herself. She rarely brought it up with anyone, least of all Megan, who had chosen a smaller, simpler life, and never seemed to resent her sister for choosing differently, though the 2 of them talked about work about as often as they talked about the weather in another country. Nathan pressed his collar flat in the bathroom mirror that evening, tugging at a shirt that hadn't seen a hanger in months, and told himself this was just dinner, nothing more, a favor to a friend and a favor to his daughter. 2 towns over, Julia checked her reflection once, decided it didn't matter either way, and left the house anyway, keys already in hand before she'd finished deciding. Neither of them had pushed past the first syllable of the other's name. Neither of them expected the one other person in the world, already tangled up in their Mondays, to be sitting behind it. At the restaurant, the silence finally broke on Julia's side. "I almost canceled this 3 times, she said. Not quite a question, not quite a confession. "I almost didn't come at all," Nathan answered, and something in his voice made it clear he meant it as more than a joke. They both let out something that wasn't quite a laugh, more a release of held breath. The waiter approached again, and Julia waved him off with 2 fingers, buying another minute neither of them knew what to do with. 14 months of Monday briefings, safety walkthroughs, 5-minute conversations over a clipboard in the yard office. None of it had prepared either of them for sitting across a lit candle, with nothing between them but a folded napkin and a question. Neither one wanted to be the first to ask out loud. "You read my old report," Nathan said eventually. It wasn't a guess. Something in the way she'd looked at him for the past year had always carried a question underneath it she never actually asked. Julia set her water glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the tablecloth like she needed something to do with her hands. Years ago, before Erie, an anonymous filing, Crane inspection findings, the kind of write-up that saves people and never gets a byline attached to it. She studied him across the table. "I didn't know it was you until I'd been your supervisor for months. Even then I wasn't sure. I never asked." "Why not?" "Because asking would have meant admitting I'd noticed something I wasn't supposed to notice." Nathan turned his water glass a quarter turn, the way he turned bolts he wasn't ready to loosen yet. Then he told her the rest of it plainly, the way a man tells something he's rehearsed alone in his truck 100 times and never once said out loud to another person. He had been a licensed structural engineer, certified on port cranes and load-bearing frameworks, 3 years into a career that mattered in ways his current job never would. His wife, Rachel, had been an engineer too, sharper than him in most rooms, and she had flagged a fault in a warehouse frame that got overruled by a project manager who wanted the deadline more than he wanted the truth. The frame failed on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Rachel didn't walk away from it. Nathan quit 6 weeks later, packed up an office full of certifications nobody in Erie would ever ask to see, and told himself he was done building things that could kill someone if he got them wrong. "I needed something steady," he said. "Something where the worst mistake I could make was a late shipment, not a funeral, even if it meant not using half of what I know." "Tell me about her," Julia said, meaning Sadie, steering them gently somewhere lighter before the silence could turn heavy. Nathan's shoulders eased for the first time all evening. "She wants to be a marine biologist this month. Last month it was an astronaut. The month before, a person who names hurricanes." He shook his head, something almost bright in his face. "She's better company than most adults I know." "I never had kids," Julia said. "Never had time to figure out if I wanted them, honestly. 14 months in this job and I've barely had time to figure out if I want a plant." "You could start smaller than a kid," Nathan said. "A cactus, maybe. Hard to kill." "I killed a cactus once." "Then I don't know what to tell you." They both laughed, easier this time, and for a moment, the restaurant noise around them fell away entirely, just candlelight, and 2 people who'd known each other's work for over a year finally learning the parts that never made it into a shift report. Julia didn't offer sympathy when he circled back, unprompted, to Rachel a few minutes later. She could tell, even after one dinner, that sympathy was the last thing he wanted from anyone. She reached across instead and slid the breadbasket an inch closer to him. And that was the whole of it. No speech, no careful words, just a small motion that said she'd heard every syllable and wasn't going to make him say more than he already had. "Monday," she said finally, standing as the check arrived, smoothing her coat over one arm, "were Miss Hartman and Mr. Griffin again, both of us." "I know how to do my job," Nathan said. "I know you do." She hesitated at the door, keys in hand, looking back at him a second longer than she meant to. "That's not what I'm worried about." He watched her walk to her car through the restaurant window and understood exactly what she meant by that, and knew, standing there with his hands in his pockets, that Monday was going to be a great deal harder than either of them had let on over dinner. He drove home the long way, past the terminal gates, past dark warehouse rooftops silhouetted against the last gray light off the lake, and found himself slowing near Crane 4 without quite meaning to, the way a man's foot finds a break before his mind catches up to why. He hadn't thought about the old work in years without some part of him flinching first. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, the thought arrived quiet instead of sharp. At home, Sadie was already asleep, the babysitter dozing in front of a muted television. Nathan paid her, walked her to her car, and stood on the porch a long while after the taillights disappeared, replaying the small, unremarkable moment of Julia's hand near the breadbasket, like it was something worth keeping safe. If you were in Nathan's shoes right now, would you ask for a transfer to protect her career, or stay exactly where you were and let the chips fall? Keep that answer in mind. Monday's shift briefing ran 4 minutes longer than usual, and everyone in the room but 2 people thought that was perfectly normal. Nathan stood at the back near the whiteboard, arms crossed, calling out load numbers the way he always did, voice flat and businesslike. Julia stood at the front reading off the week's shipping targets, in the same even tone she used for board calls, and neither of them looked at the other any longer than a briefing required. It should have been easy. It had been easy, in fact, for 14 months, right up until Friday night changed the math. After the room cleared, Nathan lingered by the door, waiting until the last dockhand had filed out. "I could ask for a transfer to the West Dock," he said. Different reporting line, cleaner for everyone. Julia's pen stopped over her clipboard. "Is that what you want?" "No," he admitted. "But I don't want you explaining to the regional board why your safety supervisor took you to dinner 3 days before a crane review." "Nobody's explaining anything," Julia said, tighter than she meant to sound. "Nothing happened that needs explaining." They both knew that wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough to leave the room on, and Nathan did, boots echoing down the corridor toward the yard. Out on the floor, he threw himself into the day's manifests harder than usual, double-checking work he normally trusted on the first pass, as if enough paperwork could crowd out the memory of candlelight and a breadbasket. A dockhand asked him twice if he was feeling all right. He said he was fine both times, and neither answer sounded convincing. In her office that afternoon, Julia pulled his personnel file from the archive, not the thin summary sheet HR kept on hand for scheduling purposes, but the full record, the one with his old engineering license number still listed under prior credentials nobody had ever bothered to update. She had read it twice before, in the detached procedural way a director reads any file. She read it a third time that afternoon, and caught herself lingering on details she'd skimmed past before, without really seeing them. 2 commendations, a resignation letter exactly 3 lines long, no explanation attached to any of it. She closed the folder before she could let herself read it a 4th time. She had spent 14 months keeping exactly the right distance from Nathan Griffin, measuring it out carefully like a woman balancing something fragile. One dinner, and the distance had a crack running through it she couldn't quite plaster back over, no matter how many files she reread, or how many times she told herself Monday would fix it. She caught herself, late that evening, standing at her office window looking down at the empty yard, Crane 4's outline dark against the dusk, and asked herself honestly whether the extra hours she'd been logging at this terminal for 14 months had ever really been about the shipping numbers at all. She didn't have an answer she liked, so she turned off the light and went home instead of sitting with it any longer. By Wednesday, Julia found herself on the yard floor more than her own calendar called for, watching Nathan work the way she hadn't let herself watch before. Not for competence, she already knew he had that in spades, but for the smaller things underneath it. The way he double-checked a cable clamp that had already passed inspection an hour earlier. The way he crouched down to a younger dockhand's eye level to explain a mistake instead of barking it across the yard, the way half the supervisors did. Todd Bishop noticed her noticing. Bishop had been vice president of operations at Great Lakes Freight for 6 years, and 14 months ago he had been the internal favorite for the regional director job that went to Julia instead, a decision he had smiled through in the announcement meeting and complained about privately to anyone who'd listen ever since. "You're spending a lot of hours down here for a director," Bishop said, falling into step beside her near Crane 4, hands in his pockets, tone almost friendly. "People talk, you know. People should talk about load schedules," Julia said, not slowing her pace. Bishop let it go outwardly, but his eyes tracked toward Nathan, coiling cable near the loading platform, and something in his expression settled into a coldness that had nothing to do with schedules at all. He'd spent 6 years telling himself the director job would eventually come around to him, that Julia's appointment was a temporary correction the board would reverse once she stumbled. 14 months in, she hadn't stumbled once, and watching her linger near a yard supervisor felt, to Bishop, like the first crack he'd been waiting for proof he could use, eventually, if he was patient enough to wait for the right moment to use it. At noon, Nathan's phone buzzed with a video call from Sadie, home sick that day with nothing worse than a cold. holding up a drawing of a sailboat on Lake Erie, done in careful, uneven crayon strokes. "I gave it 3 sails," she said, tilting the paper for the camera. "Real boats only have 2, but 3 looks better." "Three's better," Nathan agreed, smiling in a way the yard never saw from him. Later that afternoon, when the same call cut short because a load needed his attention, he found Julia already waiting by the loading gate with 2 coffees, one held out toward him before he'd said a word about needing it. "You looked like you skipped lunch," she said, like it was nothing, like she hadn't been watching for the exact moment he'd need it. He took the cup and didn't ask how she knew. Neither of them mentioned that supervisors didn't usually bring coffee to anyone. Julia had heard the tail end of the call with Sadie before she'd walked over. The unguarded warmth in his voice, a register she had never once heard him use in 14 months of briefings, and she filed it away the same careful way she'd filed everything else about him, except this time she let herself hold onto it a little longer before moving on down the row. That same week, Bishop quietly signed off on a maintenance deferral for Crane 4, pushing its full inspection back another quarter to trim the department's cost report before Friday's regional numbers went out. It wasn't the first time he'd done it. He'd been doing it in smaller, careful doses for close to 2 years, long before Julia ever arrived in Erie, and her arrival hadn't changed a habit nobody above him had ever thought to check closely. He signed the form standing up, coffee in one hand, the way a man signs something he stopped thinking of as a decision at all. Nathan noticed the deferral 2 days later while cross-referencing the week's equipment logs, a habit left over from a career he supposedly didn't practice anymore. He flagged it to the floor supervisor, who shrugged and said Bishop's office had already cleared it. Nathan let it sit for a day, uneasy, before deciding it was worth raising with Julia directly. Julia called an informal technical review the following Monday. No agenda circulated in advance, just Nathan, Bishop, and 2 engineers from the regional office gathered around a set of maintenance logs in a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner. She hadn't needed a manufactured excuse to bring Nathan into the room. 14 months of trusting his read on the yard had already made that decision for her long before Friday ever happened. The 2 regional engineers, a quiet man named Douglas, and a younger woman fresh out of a certification program, spread the inspection photos across the table without much ceremony. Expecting a routine sign-off, Nathan pulled the 3rd photo back toward himself before anyone else had finished with the first. Nathan flagged Crane 4's connector joint in under 10 minutes, pointing to a stress pattern in the inspection photos that the official report hadn't mentioned at all, not even in passing. "This isn't wear from load cycling," he said, sliding the photo across the table. "This is fatigue. It needs a full teardown, not a patch job and a signature. We patched it in the spring," Bishop cut in, voice sharper now. It passed a visual," Nathan said evenly, "not a load test. Those are 2 different things, and you know it." Bishop's voice climbed half a register, color rising in his neck. "I don't need a forklift supervisor rewriting engineering assessments in front of the regional office." "He's not rewriting anything," Julia said, calm and final, closing the folder in front of her. "He's reading it correctly, which is more than I can say for whoever signed off on this last spring. Schedule the teardown for this week. Full stop." Bishop agreed out loud and disagreed with every muscle in his face. He gathered his folder and left first, and in the doorway he glanced back at Julia a beat too long. The look of a man already deciding how he'd use this later, filing it away the same careful way she'd once filed Nathan. Douglas lingered after the room cleared, gathering the loose photos into a neat stack. "He's not wrong about the cost," he said quietly, meaning Bishop, "but he's definitely wrong about the joint." Julia thanked him and said nothing else, already thinking 3 steps ahead to the shutdown order she'd need to sign before the week was out. "Guess what happens next before you keep reading? Would you have trusted the numbers on the page, or the man who'd been signing off on them for years without question?" That night, well past midnight, a warning alarm sounded on Crane 4's control panel for 11 full seconds before it cut off on its own. The graveyard crew barely registered it over the wind coming off the lake, and nobody logged the incident in the shift report. By the time the morning shift clocked in, the alarm history showed nothing at all, as if it had never gone off in the first place. Nathan heard about it secondhand from a dockhand smoking near the gate at the time, and something about the way the man described it didn't sit right with him at all. He went looking for the one person in the yard who'd been there longer than the alarm system itself had existed. Walt Sanborn had run the yard crew at Great Lakes Freight for 31 years and had 6 months left before retirement, a date he counted down out loud more often than anyone cared to hear. He kept a small spiral notebook in his jacket pocket that nobody had ever asked to see, mostly because nobody remembered it existed at all. "You didn't hear this from me," Walt said, sliding the notebook across a workbench in the equipment shed, voice low even though they were alone. "But I've been keeping my own log since Bishop started asking me to sign inspection sheets for work I never actually did, 3 times over 2 years. I always meant to say something, kept telling myself I'd say it after I retired, once it couldn't cost me my pension." The shed smelled like grease and cold metal, one bare bulb swinging faintly overhead every time a truck rumbled past outside. Nathan flipped through pages of dates and initials, cross-referenced against maintenance records that told a much cleaner story than the truth ever had. "Why tell me now, Walt?" "Because you're the only one who ever looked twice at that crane and didn't stop looking," Walt said, closing the notebook gently, like it was something fragile. "I trust you'll do something with it. I never had the nerve myself." Nathan drove straight to Julia's house that night, notebook in hand, headlights cutting through fog rolling in off the lake, radio off, the whole drive silent except for the wipers clearing a fine mist off the windshield. He didn't rehearse what he'd say. Some things didn't need rehearsing anymore. She opened the door in a coat thrown over pajamas, immediately alert at the sight of his face. He didn't come in as a man who'd taken her to dinner 4 days earlier. He came in as an engineer who had already lost someone once to a report nobody wanted to hear. They sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning, cross-checking Walt's notes against 2 years of maintenance filings, coffee going cold between them, and somewhere around the 40th page, Julia looked up at him and understood, fully and without a shred of doubt left, that every instinct she'd trusted about this man for 14 months had been earned, never imagined. "I'm pulling Crane 4 offline first thing," she said, closing the notebook. "Full shutdown, full inspection, before another shift so much as touches it. Bishop won't like that." "Bishop doesn't get a vote," Julia said, and for the first time all night, something in her voice sounded almost steady again. The following morning, before Julia's shutdown order reached the floor supervisor, Bishop pushed through an early departure for a scheduled freighter, overriding the delay himself to protect a quarterly number he badly needed in front of the regional board that Friday. Nathan was midway across the yard, coffee in hand, when he heard a groan of metal too sharp and too sudden to be routine, coming from Crane 4's main connector joint. He didn't think. He ran, shouting the evacuation call before his brain had fully processed what his ears already knew, waving 2 dockhands clear of the swing radius seconds before the load shifted overhead. Dust sifted down from the joint in a fine gray curtain, catching the morning light for a half-second before the crack widened. The joint gave with a groan that echoed off the warehouse walls, the boom dropping 6 feet before the emergency brake finally caught it, cargo swinging wide over empty concrete, instead of over anyone's head. Nathan was already calling out shutdown sequences before the dust had settled, directing the crew with the flat, exact voice of a man who had spent years training for precisely this kind of second. Nobody was hurt. Nobody came anywhere close. Julia arrived at a dead run, breath ragged, coat unbuttoned, and found Nathan standing at the base of the crane, hands still shaking slightly at his sides, staring up at the bent connector joint like it was a wound he recognized on sight. She didn't say anything about the last 4 days, didn't say anything at all at first. She looked at what he'd just done and understood, watching him work through the aftermath, that she had never actually seen the full shape of what he used to be until this exact moment on this exact morning. Bishop reached the scene minutes later, already talking, already assembling the story he needed. "Equipment failure," he said, spreading his hands. "These things happen. We'll file it as a mechanical fault and move forward." "It's not a mechanical fault," Nathan said, turning to face him fully. "It's a maintenance record you falsified twice, and a shutdown order you overrode this morning to protect a shipping number." Bishop's face cycled through 3 expressions before settling on outrage. "That's a serious accusation from a forklift supervisor." "He's not a forklift supervisor," Julia said, stepping between them, voice carrying across the yard. He's the only reason nobody's in an ambulance right now. Walt's notebook is already on my desk. Todd, so was your shutdown override. Time stamped an hour before this happened. For the first time since Julia had known him, Bishop had nothing ready to say back. Later that afternoon, after the site had been cleared and the incident report filed, Julia found Nathan sitting on the tailgate of a maintenance truck, elbows on his knees, hands finally steady, but his face still pale under the yard lights. She didn't say anything about the report or the board or Bishop. She sat down next to him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and let the quiet do what neither of them had the words for yet. "It's the second time," Nathan said eventually. "First time I couldn't stop it. This time I could." Julia didn't tell him it wasn't the same. It wasn't, and they both knew it, and some things didn't need saying out loud to be true. The regional board convened an emergency session 2 days later, and Julia walked in with Walt's notebook, the falsified inspection sheets, Nathan's technical report, and the crane's own maintenance history laid out in a folder thick enough to end most arguments before they started. Bishop tried anyway. He spent the first 10 minutes attacking the credibility of the evidence itself, questioning Walt's memory, questioning whether a yard supervisor with no current engineering license had any standing to override a signed inspection at all. The board chair let him finish without interruption, the way a good chair lets a man talk himself into a corner. Then, when that line failed to land, Bishop pivoted to attacking the people who'd gathered the evidence in the first place. "I think it's worth asking," he said, looking directly at Julia across the long table, "how objective this whole investigation really is, given that our regional director had dinner with this particular supervisor last Friday. People downtown saw them together. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when someone has said something true and ugly in the same breath." Julia didn't flinch. She let the silence sit for exactly as long as she needed it to. "I had dinner with a man I didn't know worked for me until I sat down across the table from him," she said, evenly, meeting every eye in the room one at a time. "What I'm presenting today is a connector joint that failed under load, 2 years of falsified inspection reports, and a shutdown order you personally overrode yesterday morning to protect a number on a spreadsheet. None of that has anything to do with where I ate dinner on a Friday night. If you'd like to discuss my personal life, instead of the safety of this yard, Todd, I'm happy to let the board decide right now which one of us should actually be answering questions today." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the board chair asked Bishop to leave the room, and the vote to suspend him pending a full investigation took less than 5 minutes to close. Before the meeting adjourned, the same board offered Nathan a newly created position, regional safety and structural advisor, full authority to review every crane and frame in the district, a role built almost entirely around the exact expertise he'd spent 3 years trying to walk quietly away from. He didn't answer right away. He looked at Julia first, and she gave him nothing but a small, steady nod, the kind that said the choice was entirely his to make, and she'd respect whatever he decided either way. "I'll take it," Nathan said finally. "On one condition. Every inspection gets a name attached to it from now on. No more anonymous reports nobody has to answer for later." The board agreed without argument. Walking out of the boardroom, Julia fell into step beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for the first time all week, neither of them worried about who was watching. "You didn't have to take it," she said quietly. "I know," Nathan said. "I wanted to. That's different." She let that sit between them the rest of the walk to the elevator, and it felt, for the first time since the crane joint had cracked, like something settling back into place instead of coming apart. That weekend, Megan called Julia's cell while flipping through the Erie paper's local section over breakfast, a short 2-paragraph item about a dockyard crane failure narrowly avoided, crediting terminal supervisor Nathan Griffin by name for the quick call that kept anyone from getting hurt. "Nathan Griffin," Megan said slowly, the paper still open in front of her. "Julia, that's not the guy from the soccer bleachers, is it?" Julia let the silence answer for her a second too long to pass as nothing. "You have got to be kidding me," Megan said. "You've known him this whole time? You let me set up a blind date with someone who already works for you, and you said nothing?" "I didn't know his last name when you called," Julia said. "Neither did you, apparently, or you'd have said something first." They met at Megan's kitchen table 2 days later, all 3 of them, and Megan spent the first 10 minutes somewhere between stunned and genuinely offended before it tipped. slowly, into something closer to relief than anger. 14 months, she said, shaking her head at both of them across the table. You two worked together for 14 months, and neither of you ever said a single word to me about it. I didn't tell you what I do for a living, Julia admitted, because I wanted you to like me for something other than my title. Even you. Even my own sister. And I don't talk about the job I used to have, Nathan said, turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands, because it's the last thing I ever built with my wife. I wasn't ready to hand that story to anyone at the bleachers. Not even to someone I liked as much as you. Megan looked at them both a long moment, then laughed, short and disbelieving, shaking her head at herself now instead of them. So, I didn't actually set anyone up at all. I just finally forced the two of you to say it out loud. You did more than that, Julia said. You were right about him before either of us was ready to admit it. Megan pointed a fork at her sister. I'm always right. You two just take longer than most people to catch up. Nathan laughed for real this time. The first easy laugh either woman had heard from him all afternoon, and Megan seemed to file that away too, satisfied, like she'd finally gotten the reaction she'd been fishing for since the bleachers. Sadie met Julia properly a week later. At a lakeside picnic table, Nathan hadn't planned quite as carefully as it looked from the outside. She studied Julia with the frank, unhurried attention only a 9-year-old can manage without any self-consciousness at all. Do you like boats? Sadie asked, swinging her legs under the table. I like people who take care of them, Julia said, and meant it in more ways than the girl understood yet, glancing sideways at Nathan as she said it. Sadie considered that answer with the seriousness of a much older person, then slid her drawing across the table without being asked. You can have this one, she said. I already made a better one. Julia folded it carefully and put it in her bag instead of her pocket. The way a person keeps something they intend to hold on to for longer than an afternoon. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Bishop was formally terminated following the investigation's findings, and Nathan started his new role with a badge that carried his real title on it for the first time in 3 years. On a Friday evening that felt deliberately unremarkable, he and Julia found themselves back at the same restaurant, both of them asking for the same table without either one saying so out loud first. The hostess seated them at table 7 without a second thought, as though it had always been reserved for exactly this. Candlelight. The same low hum of conversation from the next table. The same waiter, older now by 3 weeks and nothing else. Julia noticed all of it, and said none of it out loud. Content just to let the evening repeat itself on purpose this time. There was no grand declaration between them. There didn't need to be one anymore. Julia set her hand flat on the white tablecloth, the same gesture from the first night, except this time it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a question either. Nathan looked at it for a moment. 3 years since he'd let himself reach for anything without calculating the cost first, and then he covered her hand with his, steady, unhurried, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long way, without ever once setting it down. Outside, the lake wind picked up faintly against the window, the same wind that had carried fog to Julia's porch the night Nathan showed up with Walt's notebook, as the same wind that came off Crane 4 every morning at shift change. Neither of them mentioned any of it. They didn't need to. It was simply there now, part of the ordinary weather of their life together, no longer something either of them had to brace against. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. A text from Megan. Sadie's asleep at my place. Don't rush back. Finish your dinner for once in your life. He read it, smiled, and put the phone away without checking it again. It had taken them 14 months to stop being strangers to each other in every way that mattered, and one poorly kept secret from a well-meaning sister to finally stop pretending they still were.